Okay, quickly I want to talk about some topics. Scaling phenomena, that's going to be our first big area. Allometry is the scaling of, it indicates scaling that is not isometric, in that there is some power related between, like some exponent, we'll get to these words, kind of getting ahead, that's non-trivial, right? It's not what you would expect. The shapes, or maybe a time frame or something. There's some aspects of systems that as you look at bigger and bigger versions of some part of the system, then some other part of it scales in a non-trivial way. We'll get to that. Some very interesting scaling with social phenomena as a function of city size. Biology is full of scaling, right? I mean, massive range of sizes. And you've got all these things running on these tiny little cells, right? The cells in elephants. They're similar kind of little Lego blocks that you have in mice. So what's going on with that? Okay, so that's going to be a big piece. We're going to get to what's called Zipf's law. I mentioned Zipf before. Power law size distributions, that's a big part of it. So the scaling, which is how things grow together. Power law size distributions are if we sample from a distribution, what's the probability at some size? That's more of the earthquakes or financial collapse kind of realm. That's the next area. I'll show you that's connected to Zipf's law. The 80-20 rule will come much later on, and it's connected to the 1%. Yeah, so this will lead into what, so we'll see that these scalings appear everywhere, all sorts of places, all sorts of different, biology, in engineered systems, in technological systems, and then try to get at some fundamental mechanisms that lead to them. Okay, so lead to these distributions. And a really important one is going to be this one at the bottom here, the rich get richer mechanism. So this is something that, yeah, I don't know if that helps, but this is something that's going to, we're really going to dig into. It's an enormous feature, and ultimately you'll see this is behind why people do all sorts of things. Education, cheating to get into better places, payola for music, trying to get in front in some way, because this ratchet mechanism is out there. But it's also in biology, it's also in the sciences, it's also, it's a really enormously prevalent, non kind of system specific mechanism. Robustness, this is very important, gigantic thing, right? So why do things generally not explode? And if they do, why is it so enormous? Forest fires, of course, is a huge issue again in California. It's a massive issue where I grew up in Australia. How do we contend with what is a natural phenomenon, and how do we build things so that, or do we do anything? Blah blah blah. All these problems, right? So how do we cope with risk? And it's about risk. This will then connect quite beautifully, I think, to optimizing how you locate facilities. There's sort of a flip version of this. Where do you put your Starbucks? Where do you put your schools, so that some social good is optimized? And that could be, a true social good where it's not too far to schools on average for kids, or it could be a different kind of social good where the coffee shop makes as much money as possible by allocating all of their, right? So you wouldn't just lay down you wouldn't look at a grid of the US and put a Starbucks every 100 miles in a grid. You just wouldn't do it. So obviously you're not going to do that. We're going to put it where people live. But then it turns out we're going to do that in a very structured way, naturally, and potentially purposely, but we'll do it naturally, depending on what we're trying to do: make money or make people's lives better. Fundamentals of complexity, that's a piece that we'll come back to in the middle of the course and then later at the end. I mentioned gravity, big deal here, and talked about some of these pieces. Measurement, just how fundamental measurement is. Measuring time, that wasn't easy. Measuring temperature, not easy. So if we start to think about measuring, economic performance, and which we seem to be quite happy with, running around saying, oh, the Dow is this, that's a pretty messy business. given how much we've been able to nail down what we have in physical systems. We really, really, really know how to measure stuff there. And again, emergence, right? So we'll come back to that. Complex networks, it has this origin in statistical mechanics, which has this origin in physics, and I'll talk about how that really has an origin in thinking about people. So that's a nice bit of nice work for humans there. So complex networks is a huge piece, as I've mentioned, and I'll give you some history there. I think it's important because I'm that old, and yeah, lots of fun pieces. That will lead into, broadly, socio-technical systems, which will be disease spreading. So we'll talk about pandemics, and we'll talk about how they're deeply uncertain. We'll talk about problems with the way they're being measured, and I will come back to this in this course throughout, because I think as much as anything that's gone wrong, the measurement and the dashboards and all these pieces have been really, really a problem. But of course, fundamentally, it's a leadership issue. Schelling's model of segregation. It's a powerful story that's going to lead into a deeply sobering one. We'll show how that's connected to these basic imitation kinds of models, which again tell powerful stories with sort of very minimal mechanic. So the thing is, you can understand the systems, like, oh, these are the only two things that can happen. You're like, okay, all right, fine. And then you let it run, you're like, oh, that's really surprising. So it's a bit of a game, really, in trying to get those little models to tell us something interesting about the world. So collective behavior, this global cooperation part, all these things, and that will lead into ultimately stories, contagious stories. How do people vote? How does fame take off, right? So this will come back to the rich gets rich model. We'll just see that model itself, or that mechanism, just appears over and over and over. It's a very, very easy to construct and sort of very easily accessed kind of mechanism. So, and a big piece in here will be fame, right? Unpredictable fame. And just for free, we'll tell you how to make things spread, right? How to become famous. Easy. But basically, we'll tell you how. And unfortunately, this is deeply understood by some people, and it's why certain services like Facebook have become really dangerous in the way they function. So POX has been, we've been criticizing Facebook since we started 2007, and so we'll get to that. But it's about networks and spreading. Yeah, so fate doesn't exist. So it's kind of a nice thing to have come to. You may not believe that's true, but I'm going to show you experiments and results that kind of push that into the truth column. So yeah, we'll talk about some of these other pieces potentially, right? Happiness and cities. We'll touch on them for sure. Especially in scaling the cities part. But yeah,